With the 2023 NBA season coming to a close, it's time to rank the game's best players. This is the fourth part of a 5-video series breaking down my top 25. But before we continue the rankings, I'll do a quick rundown of my criteria. The question I'm answering is if I'm trying to contend for a championship, who's going to offer the most value at that level? This means I'm more focused on the playoffs, looking at the different skill sets and tendencies of each player in the context of a competitive team. I'm also looking at when these players are actually on the floor. Injuries weren't heavily considered unless they directly impacted that player's production. For a more in-depth look at everything I value and the entire criteria, make sure to check out the first video of the series. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Just to recap my first 15, I had Jimmy, LeBron, Booker, Zion, Mitchell, Ja, Shea, Kyrie, and PG as all-NBA level players, Trey, Bam, Murray, Harden, Jaren, and Anthony Edwards all as all-star level players. And without further ado, let's continue the rankings. Coming in at 10, I've got Jason Tatum. Tatum is unique in that he's a big, lengthy forward, but has a relatively tight handle, can get through gaps, and quickly change directions when attacking with a live dribble. He's not necessarily an explosive athlete, but plays with pace really well, mapping the defense, patiently hunting for driving lanes, and using lengthy strides to get to the rim. He's also really strong. Whereas he used to only look to slither his way in deep, now he initiates contact and bumps defenders a lot more to create separation, which helps him get to the line at a much more consistent rate. As a finisher, he's pretty good, often looking to get to soft touch finger rolls or scoops around defenders in the paint, and also added the floater this season, giving him some more versatility. He's also a very good slasher off the catch, with quick, decisive attacks to burn closeouts or keep defenses in rotation. And in general, his off-ball game is super sharp, filled with constant movement, screening or cutting in set actions, and of course some elite 3-point shooting. He's a big-time shooter off the catch and off of movement. He also takes a lot of pull-up threes, and I don't think he's necessarily great at these, but it's more than enough to keep the defense honest. He'll weaponize his driving threat with hesitations or step backs, and has a really high release that allows him to get the ball up over defenders. One thing that I think holds him back is that he's going away from the mid-range a lot more. This was never a great shot for him efficiency-wise, but could be used as a weapon in spots, and has been almost abandoned. I think this makes his scoring a bit easier to counter, as in the playoffs he hasn't been an elite scorer, just solid volume on about average efficiency, which I think represents him fairly well. One thing his scoring does though is really draw aggressive coverages, especially off of screens. He's a pretty huge advantage creator. Like I mentioned in his driving, the patience and added pace has allowed him to see the floor a lot better, making some pretty high level reads over the top of the defense. He's especially good at finding shooters, with the range and velocity needed to make those higher level skip passes, and when he can see a play unfolding, he'll pretty much always capitalize. With that said, he's not an elite processor, and doesn't have a great passing game on the floor, so he sometimes struggles to take advantage of tight windows or added aggression, and as a result can tend to turn the ball over in bunches. Regardless, he's got those lead ball handler capabilities, and when he's got it going can score in a ton of different ways both on and off the ball. This dynamic attack leaves him really flexible, a solid all-NBA level offensive player in my opinion. Defensively, he's just such a high-level helper, especially at the nail where he shuts off driving lanes with his length, active hands, and constant activity. He also has utility on the backline, really good positioning and timing as a rim protector, and elite defensive rebounding at his position. During these playoffs, he grabbed more than 9 defensive rebounds a game, third in the NBA behind only AD and Jokic. As a man defender, I think he's somewhat vulnerable in space against shiftier guards, as he's not the quickest laterally and isn't a perfect screen navigator. But that's also just nitpicking because he can offer serious resistance on the perimeter. He's also ultra switchable, with the size and strength needed to match up with bigger creators, and the way he uses his hands really limits ball handlers, especially those with more length. I did like his motor a bit more last season when Boston was on their tour de force of a defensive run, but regardless, I still think he's an all defensive level guy whose versatility really bolsters a playoff defense. When paired with his offense, that's enough to make him the first week MVP level player on my list. Next up at 9 is Damian Lillard. Dame just had one of the best offensive seasons in NBA history, but due to some lackluster team play and blatant tanking to end the season, it kinda flew under the radar. Outside of Steph Curry, he's pretty comfortably the best pull-up three-point shooter I've ever seen, with absurd, game-breaking range, a legit threat to score the moment he crosses half court. He's got an incredibly quick trigger off the floor, a master of the stop and pop as he scores in impossibly small windows, and is also a pretty big space creator, throwing some jarring step backs or side steps from 30 feet out, which is not at all normal. He's a ridiculous difficult shot maker, shooting right through contests or while off balance, and all of these things allow him to ramp up the volume to ridiculous rates. This season he took more than 7 pull-up threes a game and hit over 37% of them, which with his diet of shots is obscene. Of course, he demands a ton of attention on the perimeter, drawing aggressive ball pressure at the point of attack, and can't come off a screen without seeing a second body, which then opens up his driving game. He's a quick burst athlete with a really sharp handle, using hesitations and pauses to leverage his shooting before exploding, or turning the corner with speed to attack bigs in space. At the rim, his finishing is pretty good, great touch with a strong offhand, and he's very lengthy for his size, using timely strides to carve out easier angles, although his size can be limiting at times, and he's not particularly great at scoring through contact. When attacking downhill, he's incredible at generating free throws. He's got all the tricks, just using his body so well, and of course capitalizing on those free throws at a 91% clip. This combination of 30-foot pull-up shooting and explosive driving leaves him the game's best pick-and-roll scorer, and I'm not sure it's particularly close. He led the league at 12.5 points per game on these plays, on absolutely incredible efficiency, and there just isn't a single coverage that seems to be a viable option. It's in these spots where he does a ton of damage as a playmaker. When coming off of screens, the offense essentially has a guaranteed advantage. He can make those tight window passes to rollers, both on the floor and in the air, is pretty good at surveying the court when getting into actions. If off-ball defenders slide over, he'll hit shooters. And that explosive driving game allows him to collapse the defense, boasting an incredibly good drive and kick game. He's extremely low error, not a guy who's going to actively pick apart defenses with the most impressive passing you've ever seen, but also not turning the ball over. Just efficient volume shot creation. If you wanted to point out a flaw, I think it'd be that sometimes his inside the arc attack can look a little bit too sped up. He doesn't often probe with his dribble, or play at a slow pace to map the floor, which also hurts him as an in-between scorer. I think he picks his spots well and is obviously a great shooter, but this is an area of the floor that lacks in comparison. For these reasons, I don't think he'd quite be in my first tier of playoff scorers. But then again, we haven't seen him since his scorching first round series against the Nuggets. His mega shot creation, constant pressure, and ability to create shots for the guys around him efficiently does leave him one of the game's most valuable on-ball players. If I had to put a number on it, I think you could make the argument that he's the third best player in the NBA with the ball in his hands, at the very least top 7. With that said, he's also very good off the ball. Under Chauncey Billups, we saw this side of his game tapped into a bit more, utilized off of screens and movement, where he showcases that all-time great shooting. He demands attention at all times, no matter where he stands on the floor, just adding so much spacing, and he'll use his threat as a movement shooter to open up playmaking opportunities with quick decisions off the catch, or counter-aggressive coverage with some really sharp cutting. Overall, I think he's at worst a top 6 offensive player in the NBA, maybe even higher than that, adding near strong MVP value on that end of the floor. On the defensive end is where we start to run into a few problems. I think within the context of Portland, it looks a lot worse than it actually is, but it's still a pretty big flaw. More often than not, he's just trying to hide on an opponent's worst offensive player, where he's not very active. He doesn't bring anything as a helper, his size prevents him from altering anything down low, and he doesn't make any plays in lanes or gaps, just kind of out there. On the ball, he doesn't move his feet particularly well, struggles getting around screens, and can't really switch on to bigger players. I don't think he's completely useless, like he's willing to play physical and get up into ball handlers, has pretty active hands, I mentioned the length, and I think on a competitive team, he's shown some level of buy-in. Overall, I think he's a pretty strong negative, not quite among the worst in the NBA. This brings him down a decent amount, but still a weak MVP level player overall. As for number 8, that's Anthony Davis. Despite a disappointing exit in the Western Conference Finals, AD had one of the best rim protecting playoff runs we've seen in a very long time. The Lakers had an elite playoff defense, and a ton of that is him just doing everything. He's 6'10 with a 7'6 wingspan, a massive space eater, but is incredibly mobile with quick reflexes that allow him to rotate to any potential threat. He's a really strong vertical presence off of 2 feet, and pairs that with perfect timing and ball targeting to meet any attacker at the rim and send away their shot, averaging more than 3 blocks a game during these playoffs. When he's not blocking a shot, he's still significantly altering it. Players shot more than 16% worse than their expected field goal percentage with him contesting at the rim, a game-changing number. Another huge thing is that although he's contesting and altering so many shots at the rim, he doesn't foul, showing incredible discipline as he knows exactly which risks to take. The main reason why LA's free throw disparity was getting so much buzz. He's also a massive deterrent, positioning himself well, using his length, and keeping his hands active to drive shots away from the paint. That combination of length and quick hands helps him make a ton of plays on the ball, in lanes, and helps him when defending the pick and roll, as he's a guy who can perfectly execute every single last coverage or switch onto smaller players. He moves so well on his feet, is flexible and agile enough to stick with quick changes of direction or changes of speed, and his size and strength allow him to lock down in the post, truly covering every position when necessary. To top it all off, he's maybe the game's best defensive rebounder, so what you get is this ultra switchable, versatile big that's the best rim protector in the NBA and will always close possessions. He only really has 2 true flaws. The major one is that he doesn't always get back in transition. Bigs can and will beat him down the floor for easy offense pretty consistently. The other is his activity. For the most part, he's engaged, but there are plays that he's more than capable of making, instead choosing to rest or save his body. These are things that I'd say hold him back from being a top 10 or so defender in league history. I still think he's the best defender in the NBA right now, adding low All-NBA or high All-Star type of value just on that end of the floor. Offensively, he's pretty exclusively used as a play finisher at this point, and within that role, he's really good. What immediately stands out to me is his hands. There's not a pass he can't catch, or an angle he's uncomfortable going to get the ball, and this allows him to finish with momentum as a roller or cutter extremely well. It also makes him a massive lob threat, which gives him some vertical spacing, as he's not a guy defenses want to help off of down low. He does this through offensive rebounding as well, huge on the glass, and if he secures second chances around the basket, automatic putbacks. His touch around the rim is really good, which also stands out when looking to score from a bit further. Coverages are a lot harder in the pick and roll because he's such a huge threat at the rim, but also effective in the short mid-range with little jumpers and floaters right over the top of paint protectors. He even has a super advanced handle for his size, capable of putting it down and attacking in the short roll, and all of these things allow him to absolutely abuse mismatches. Switching is not a viable option. Despite doing almost all of his work off the ball, he puts a ton of pressure on the rim and generates a decent amount of free throws, which he hits at a very healthy 85%. Where the problem lies though, is that he's nowhere near the self-creator he once was. He's not nearly as agile, struggling to self-generate shots at the rim, and although he still has the mid-range threat, he was a noticeably better shooter a few years ago. I also think his passing leaves a lot to be desired. He can make reads from a standstill to hit cutters or shooters, but when attacking, doesn't really leverage the threat of his scoring in any meaningful way. He's not a guy you can run a ton of offense through with the ball. As a result, his volume as a scorer just isn't on par with what we see from some primary offensive stars, and with some of his limitations, he isn't making up that ground with uber efficient production. I think this keeps him at about a low all-star level on offense, maybe even a touch lower, but still pairs with his defense extremely well to make him one of the best two-way players on the planet, and a weak MVP overall. At 7, I've got Luka Doncic. Luka is the heaviest on-ball player we've ever seen. He always has the ball, but he also has a seemingly endless amount of ways to attack a defense. His approach is incredibly patient and methodical, looking to get into the paint as much as possible. He's better than just about anyone at changing pace, not explosive, but perfect understanding of angles and timing, knowing exactly when and where to attack. He's said to have more than a 7-foot wingspan, but the ball is on a string, such an effective and secure handle that leaves him nearly impossible to stay in front of. That length also helps him on his strides, taking every last extra step to get deep into the paint, and he just has amazing touch around the rim. There's not an angle or layup he's uncomfortable going to down low, and he's extremely creative with his releases. Even when he can't get all the way to the rim, he has an elite float game, can go to weird running hooks. There's no shortage of ways he can score in the paint. He'll create separation for himself with those changes of speed. His ability to just slam the brakes is one of one. Also through contact, dropping his shoulder into the chest of defenders and using his large frame to just bully his way to the rim. The way he throws his weight and size around also helps him get to the line at a very high rate, although he hasn't been a good free throw shooter in the playoffs at all, so this could be his kryptonite. Another way he'll create separation down low is through masterful footwork, throwing all types of different spins, fakes, pivots to just shed defenders, which help give him some utility in the post. Especially against smaller defenders, he'll just use that size to bully his way to the paint for finishing opportunities or a solid hook shot. He's a post technician, reading his matchup incredibly well and countering with sharp spins, fakes, some more beautiful displays of that footwork. He'll also create jumpers, often using that shoulder to initiate contact before falling away, and even the best contests leave him virtually unbothered. This holds true for his mid-range game in general. He's an incredible difficult shot maker who can get into these looks in a wide variety of ways, which pairs with his driving game extremely well, as when he's unable to get to the paint, he'll just fall back on these with great efficiency and can create separation for himself with bumps, step backs, sidesteps, spins, and you'll see these exact same things all the way out on the perimeter, where he weaponizes the threat of his drives into brilliant off-the-dribble three-point shooting. He's not a huge space creator, but does enough to make some really tough shots, and ramp up the volume of his shooting to near league highs. Overall, he's one of the league's only true 3-level scorers, and can do it in every single way imaginable, out of any play, initiating from anywhere. This makes him so incredibly difficult to defend in the playoffs. He's the highest volume shot creator in the league, and it's not even close, and has so many different counters that it's hard to see him having a truly inefficient series, even if his shot isn't falling. It's also worth noting that we didn't even get a playoff sample from him this year, and I think this is pretty clearly the best version of him we've seen thus far, so those numbers could get even better. The craziest part though, this arguably isn't even his best skill. He's one of the most versatile passers the game has ever seen. Because of his size, he has access to those angles over the top of defenses like a big, and he doesn't miss anything, capable of getting the ball to every single inch of the floor with a live dribble. His anticipation is off the charts, knowing where every defender's gonna be before they actually rotate, and using that to create both wide open threes and shots at the rim. His driving game consistently collapses the defense, creating more high quality jumpers than anyone, and he'll use his eyes or motions to move defenders around like chess pieces. He'll go to jump passes, has a 360-degree radius, can get it through every tight window, and is insanely creative. He truly is one of the best volume playmakers in league history. As a result, Dallas has had some elite, resilient playoff offenses with him leading the charge, despite not playing next to another star or some of the league's best off-ball talent. It's pretty clear to me that Luka Ball works. Now, the off-ball concerns are obvious. He's not a good shooter off the catch, not an active mover or great cutter, but he's not useless. He can play off the catch pretty well, a great connector and slasher, and is a pretty good screener, creating a lot of mismatches to attack. I think his lack of value off the ball does limit him in some facets. He'd have more trouble fitting next to other high-end players in a way that some other offensive juggernauts wouldn't, and he sort of limits the flexibility of his team's system. To get the most value out of him, that heliocentric ball is necessary. So this is what just holds him back for me in the grand scheme, but regardless, he's at worst a top 3 offensive player in the NBA, adding strong MVP value on that end. His defense is a little weird. We saw him play a role on a high-level defensive team last year, and that wasn't a squad with a ton of great personnel. I think his activity, IQ, and positioning off the ball are pretty strong positives. His size and length allow him to cover space, and he's a decent vertical presence off of 2 feet protecting the rim. He's also a great defensive rebounder in these spots and will communicate, just playing this role well. One problem is the foot speed. He can't really cover multiple threats at once, having to commit to one or the other, and he's not good on closeouts. This is what also hurts him as an on-ball defender. He's vulnerable in space because he can't keep the ball in front of him, and really struggles getting around screens. I do think his strength, active hands, and length give him some capability, and he's relatively switchable, but it's problematic nonetheless. I view him as a negative. I think he has moments where he looks neutral and isn't at all some huge, team-altering liability, just losing some value, but remaining the first strong MVP level player on this list due to his vast offensive game. Next up at 6 is Joel Embiid. Embiid is so physically gifted. He's almost always the biggest and strongest player on the floor, but moves with fluidity and body control that you would expect from an athletic wing. He also has some of the best touch we've ever seen from someone of that size, an elite finisher around the rim that can shoot from all over the floor and has legit ball handling capability. He'll use these things in isolation, facing up from anywhere where he can shoot over the top, set up pull-up jumpers with some tough shot making, or explode on dribble drives. He's masterful at drawing fouls in these spots, throwing his large frame into defenders, initiating and selling contact, great use of up fakes. He really just has all of the tricks, whether it's ripping through, hooking the arm. There's no way to stop him from getting to the line, and because he hits 86% of those opportunities, it's just automatic offense in the half court. Of course, he also has a more traditional back to the basket game as well. He's really good at sealing deep position, using his massive frame and great hands to set up easy entries, and can attack with power or finesse, sporting some unreal footwork and use of constant fakes or spins. He's just so agile, which at his size allows him to physically overwhelm just about everyone who stands in his way. Now, what I think he's added more and more is utility away from the ball. He's a really effective screen and roll big, often looking to float to the mid-range for short jumpers, but can roll hard and finish with momentum, is capable of putting the ball down in the short roll, and occasionally will even pop to the three-point line. As a screener, he demands a lot of defensive attention, which helps open up ball handlers. He's also capable of playing off the catch as a perimeter weapon, gunning out of the slot with quick attacks where he's just a freight train going downhill. As a scorer in the playoffs, his numbers are pretty underwhelming for someone of his capabilities. I think some of this is injuries, some of it is mental lapses, but I also think his lack of playmaking allows defenses to key in on his scoring, therefore giving it less value. Playmaking is the problem in his game. He really lacks processing speed and vision, missing quick openings, or handling straight into defenders because he just straight up doesn't know where they are. I think he can be a talented passer from a standstill. We've seen him hit cutters and shooters, especially out of double teams, with great success. But when defenses start to disguise their coverages and send help from different spots, he just can't make those reads. And even worse, he struggles leveraging his scoring. Once he puts it down on an attack, he's no longer looking for teammates. Added attention just comes and makes it more difficult on him individually. Of every player I considered for the list, he's one of only 2 averaging more turnovers than assists in the playoffs. His mark of 3.8 every 75 possessions is only reached by the highest volume creators and passers. So while he's such a talented scorer, this area of his game really holds him back. I think some injuries and also a lack of creativity in Philly's offense has made him look a little worse than he otherwise would be in a playoff setting. But regardless, he needs a lot of passing talent on the floor to lead strong offenses in the postseason, and I think of him as a solid All-NBA level player on that end. He makes up a lot of that ground by also being a really good defender. He plays like a traditional defensive anchor, using his size and length to shut off the lane and deter attackers. His positioning when dropping in the pick and roll is incredible, capable of taking away multiple threats at once, and he moves really well for his size, turning and changing directions to make high-level plays or clogging up lanes with quick hands. Sometimes he's a bit overly paint-bound, or misses some rotations to conserve energy, but these problems aren't as noticeable come playoff time. He's clearly more engaged and active. He doesn't offer much versatility, which I think limits the flexibility of his team's defense, but he's also a one-man anchor protecting the paint, allowing Philly to put out some weaker defensive units and still find success. I'd say he's pretty close to a top 5 defender in the NBA. In many ways, a sort of discount Rudy Gobert from his Jazz days. In my opinion, adding all-star level value on that end. All-star level defense and All-NBA level offense are enough to get him to a strong MVP level overall, just missing out on my top 5. Just to recap my 6 through 10, I've got Embiid and Luka as strong MVP level players, AD, Dame, and Tatum as weak MVP level players. To stay tuned with the rest of the list, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and turn my post notifications on. If you're interested in some more of my in-depth research, make sure to check out my website and social media profiles. You can find those links in the description. Feel free to let me know down in the comments what you agree and disagree with so far. As always, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.